On the front lines, Eddie's invention became standard practice. A simple device, quiet, deadly, and
At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton crouched in a muddy ditch outside Cassino, Italy, watching a German armored scout car roll toward his position at 15 Mapi Mayaha. He had no anti-tank weapons, no mines, no grenades. Just a piece of rusted barbed wire wrapped around two shovel handles that every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly forbidden him from using. In the next 90 seconds, that improvised tripwire would flip military doctrine on its head and trigger a chain reaction that would save over 400 American lives in the next 6 months. The official U.S. Army Field Manual listed 16 approved methods for disabling light armor. Dalton's wasn't one of them. Battalion Command had threatened him with court-martial twice for unauthorized field modifications. But regulations don't mean much when you've watched 11 men die in 3 weeks, because the approved methods require equipment nobody has. The morning fog clung to the Leary Valley like wet cotton. Dalton could hear the SdKfz 222's engine grinding through gears, the commander's hatch open, probably scanning for American positions everyone knew were there. The wire trembled in his hands. One chance. He waited. This is the story of how a railroad switchman from Gary, Indiana, became the most dangerous man the German Reconnaissance Corps never knew existed. In February 1944, the Italian campaign had devolved into a grinding nightmare of attrition. The 34th Infantry Division was stuck in the mountains south of Cassino, fighting for every village, every ridge, every muddy kilometer. But what was killing more Americans than German machine guns or artillery was something the Army hadn't properly prepared for. German reconnaissance vehicles. Specifically, the SdKfz 222 armored scout car. 4-wheeled, open-topped, armed with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34 machine gun. Fast enough to escape any pursuit, armored enough to shrug off rifle fire, light enough to navigate mountain roads that Tigers and Panzers couldn't use. They appeared out of nowhere at dawn and dusk, probing American positions, mapping defensive layouts, then vanishing before anyone could respond. 12 hours later, German artillery would rain down on those exact positions with devastating accuracy. The pattern was predictable and lethal. American doctrine said to engage reconnaissance vehicles with anti-tank rifles, bazookas, or mines. The problem was brutally simple. Nobody had any. The 34th Infantry Division had 9 bazookas for the entire division. 9. Anti-tank rifles had been phased out in 1942. Mines were reserved for static defensive positions, not daily patrols. So American soldiers died while scout cars mapped their positions and called in the artillery strikes that killed them the next day. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski died on February 18, 1944. A 222 rolled past his foxhole at dawn. Kowalski fired his M1 Garand. The rounds sparked harmlessly off the armor. The scout car's MG-34 answered. Kowalski took 3 rounds in the chest. He was 20 years old, from Pittsburgh, a machinist's son who'd enlisted with Dalton on the same day back in Gary. They'd gone through basic training together, shipped to North Africa together, landed in Italy together. Now Kowalski was dead because the Army couldn't provide the weapons needed to stop a vehicle that weighed less than 2 tons. Sergeant Mike Brennan died on February 23rd. Another 222, another dawn patrol. Brennan tried to hit it with a grenade from 30 yards. Missed. The autocannon found him. 3 seconds of 20mm high explosive rounds. There wasn't enough left of Brennan to send home. He'd taught Dalton how to set up a proper fighting position, how to read terrain, how to keep your feet dry in the Italian mud. He was 24, from Brooklyn, 4 sisters waiting for him back home. His mother would get the telegram on March 2nd. Western Union delivery at 3 p.m. She'd know before the messenger even knocked. Corporal Luis Vargas died on March 4th. The 222s were getting bolder now. This one drove right through the company's position, at dusk machine gun blazing, hunting for targets. Vargas was from El Paso, spoke better Spanish than English, always shared his cigarettes, even when he only had 3 left. The autocannon caught him running for cover. The company medic, a kid from Ohio named Henderson, tried for 20 minutes to stop the bleeding. Couldn't do it. Vargas died asking for his mother in Spanish. Henderson cried for an hour afterward. He'd seen plenty of death by then. But something about Vargas broke through. By early March 1944, the 34th Infantry Division had lost 47 men to reconnaissance vehicles in 6 weeks. Not from major battles or assaults. Just scout cars doing their job while Americans had no answer. Dalton watched each death. He knew Kowalski and Brennan personally. Vargas had been in his squad for 2 months. Each death felt preventable. Each death made him angrier. And each death made him think harder about the problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. Jimmy Dalton grew up in Gary, Indiana, where his father worked the blast furnaces at U.S. Steel. 15-hour shifts pouring molten iron for a paycheck that barely covered rent and food for 6 kids. Jimmy was the middle child, the one who spent afternoons at the railroad yards instead of school learning which train cars carried, which couplings failed most often, and how to rig temporary fixes with whatever scrap metal he could find. At 17, he was apprenticing as a switchman, the guys who connected and disconnected freight cars in the massive rail yards that fed the steel mills. The work taught him to think in systems to see how one failure cascaded into another. A loose coupler pin could derail 6 cars. A frayed cable could snap and kill a brakeman. You learned to spot problems before they became disasters, and you learned to fix them with wire rope and creativity, because U.S. Steel sure as hell wasn't buying new equipment when the old stuff could be jury-rigged to work. Dalton got good at it. Really good. By 1942, he could diagnose a failing coupling system just by listening to the sound it made under stress. He could rig a temporary fix with materials other switchmen would throw away. He enlisted in January 1943, 3 months after his 19th birthday. The recruiter promised training, steady pay, and a chance to see the world beyond the gray industrial sprawl of northwest Indiana. Dalton got 8 weeks of basic training, a rifle he'd never fired before, and a troopship to North Africa. By the time he reached Italy in September 1943, he'd seen enough of the world to know the recruiter had lied about everything else too. The 34th Infantry Division ground its way up the Italian peninsula like a rusty millstone. Every village was contested. Every ridge had German machine guns. Every river crossing cost lives. But it was the scout cars that haunted him. They were the eyes of the German army, and without them, the Wehrmacht would be blind. Stop the reconnaissance, and you stop the artillery. Stop the artillery, and maybe Kowalski and Brennan and Vargas would still be alive. Dalton started studying the problem the way he'd studied failing couplings in the Gary rail yards. The 222s always used the same roads. They moved fast, but followed predictable routes. Morning patrols came from the north between 6:30 and 7:00 a.m. Evening patrols from the east between 5:00 and 6:00 p.m. They favored dirt roads with tree cover places where they could observe American positions without being easily spotted. And they had one vulnerability nobody was exploiting: their wheels. The 222 sat on 4 standard road wheels, 13 to 15 inches off the ground, depending on load. The front axle was exposed, vulnerable to anything that could catch it at speed. Dalton had seen a destroyed 222 during a patrol 2 weeks earlier. German crew had abandoned it after hitting a crater. He'd measured the axle height. 14 inches exactly. He'd examined the wheel assembly. Standard automotive design, nothing special, nothing reinforced. An idea started forming. Back in Gary, when a freight car needed to be stopped quickly, switchmen would sometimes throw a coupling pin into the wheels. The pin would jam the wheel, lock the axle, and the momentum would do the rest. Violent, crude, but effective. What if you could do the same thing to a scout car? Not with a pin, but with wire. Barbed wire stretched across a road at exactly 14 inches tight enough to catch the front axle at speed. The physics made sense. A 222 moving at 15 mph had significant momentum. If you suddenly lock at one front wheel, that momentum would pivot the entire vehicle around the locked wheel. Best case, it would spin out and crash. Worst case, it would flip. Either way, the scout car would be disabled and the crew neutralized. Dalton mentioned the idea to Sergeant Brennan 3 days before Brennan died. They were sharing a cigarette in a cold February rain, watching the road where a 222 had passed an hour earlier. "What if we rigged wire across the roads?" Dalton said. "Low height, tight enough to catch the axles." Brennan had looked at him like he'd suggested using slingshots. "Army's got protocols for obstacles, Jimmy. Wire entanglements, tank traps, all that engineering corps stuff. You can't just string wire across a road." "Why not?" "Because you'll trip our own guys, because it's not in the manual, because Captain Morrison would have your ass in a sling for unauthorized modifications." Brennan took a drag on the cigarette. "I get what you're thinking. But the brass won't go for it. Too improvised, too risky." 3 days later, Brennan was dead. The official response from Battalion after Vargas died was exactly what Dalton expected. Captain Morrison held a meeting on March 6th. 20 exhausted soldiers crammed into a barn that smelled like gunpowder and wet wool. Morrison stood at the front, his uniform cleaner than theirs, because he'd just arrived from division headquarters. "Higher command is aware of the reconnaissance problem," Morrison said, reading from notes. "New bazooka shipments are expected within the month. Until then, maintain defensive posture and follow engagement protocols. Do not attempt unauthorized countermeasures." Dalton stood in the back. He'd been thinking about the wire problem for weeks now, refining the concept in his head. He knew it would work. He knew it because the physics were identical to what he'd done 100 times in the Gary rail yards. But he also knew Morrison wouldn't approve. The Army didn't like improvisation. The Army liked doctrine procedures, approved methods tested and validated by engineers who'd never been shot at. "Sir," Dalton said, "what if we rigged wire across the roads the scouts use low height aimed at the axles?" Morrison looked at him with the particular exhaustion of an officer who'd heard too many desperate ideas from enlisted men. "Corporal, the field manual is very clear on authorized anti-vehicle obstacles. Wire entanglements are defensive measures requiring specific positioning and engineering support. They're not booby traps for roads." "But sir, if we—" "The answer is no. Corporal, we're not setting random tripwires that could injure our own men or violate protocols. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Morrison's tone softened slightly. "I understand the frustration. We're all frustrated. But we follow doctrine. We wait for proper equipment. We don't improvise solutions that could create more problems than they solve." Dismissed. Dalton said nothing more, but he didn't forget, and he didn't stop thinking. The scout cars kept coming. More men kept dying. The approved methods required equipment nobody had, and nobody was sending. The unauthorized method required wire shovels and a willingness to risk court-martial. On the night of March 10, 1944, Dalton made his decision. Another 222 had killed 2 men that afternoon, Privates Chen and Harrison. Chen was a radio operator from San Francisco, always humming jazz tunes while he worked. Harrison was from Oklahoma, talked constantly about his family's farm, about getting back to plant wheat again. Both dead because a scout car rolled through at 4:00 p.m., and nobody could stop it. Dalton waited until midnight. The company was dug in along the Rapido River Valley, 2 miles south of Casino. German positions were clearly visible on the ridgeline to the north. The scout cars used a dirt road that ran parallel to the Allied lines about 400 yards out. Predictable route, decent tree cover, perfect for reconnaissance runs. He grabbed a coil of barbed wire from the supply dump. 30 feet rusted, but strong. He took 2 entrenching tools, the standard issue folding shovels every soldier carried. And he moved out alone. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. The March night was cold. Mud sucked at his boots with every step. He could hear artillery rumbling to the north, constant and distant like thunder that never stopped. The road was empty, but that didn't mean safe. German patrols used it too. If they caught him out here alone, he was dead or captured. Neither option appealed. He found a spot where the road narrowed between two oak trees. Good visibility from the American lines, limited visibility from the German side until you were right on top of it. Perfect. He drove the first shovel into the ground on the left side of the road, angling it back toward the American positions. The blade sank 6 inches into the mud, not deep enough. He used a rock to hammer it deeper, 12 inches, stable. The handle stuck up at a 45-degree angle. The second shovel went in on the right side of the road, 18 feet across. He measured it by pacing the way he'd measured coupling distances in the rail yards. Then came the wire. He wrapped it around the first shovel's handle, 3 loops tight as he could make them. His hands were slick with mud and rust. The wire bit into his palms through his gloves. He could feel blood mixing with the cold. He stretched the wire across the road at exactly 14 inches off the ground. Not ankle height, not waist height, axle height for a light armored car. He'd measured that destroyed 222 carefully. The front axle sat between 13 and 15 inches depending on load. The wire had to catch it at speed without breaking immediately. He wrapped the other end around the second shovel. 3 loops again, mirror image of the first side. Then he tested the tension. He pulled the wire. It hummed. The shovels held. This was the critical part. Too loose, and the wire would snap or pull free. Too tight, and it would break on impact. He needed it just right. Tight enough to catch and hold for that crucial half-second, loose enough to have some give. He adjusted, tightened slightly, tested again. The wire sang when he plucked it, a low musical note that cut through the night. The whole setup took 23 minutes. He sat in the ditch afterward, catching his breath, watching the road. If a patrol came now, he'd have to run and hope they didn't see him. If an officer found out what he'd done, court-martial was guaranteed. If it worked, maybe fewer men would die. That was the calculation. Simple math from the railroad yards. Risk versus reward. He buried the wire under a thin layer of mud. Not enough to weaken it, just enough to make it invisible in low light. The shovels looked like abandoned equipment, rusted and half-buried. Someone would have to be looking directly at them to notice, and by the time they did, it would be too late. Dalton crawled back to the American lines at 1:15 a.m. He didn't tell anyone. He couldn't. Morrison had been explicit. This was unauthorized. This violated doctrine. This was exactly the kind of initiative that got you punished in the Army, even if it saved lives. Especially if it saved lives, because then you'd proven the brass wrong. He lay in his foxhole and waited for dawn. The wire was out there, invisible and waiting. Somewhere in the German lines, a 222 crew was probably getting ready for their morning patrol. They had no idea what was waiting for them on that narrow road between the oak trees. Neither did Dalton. Not really. He'd done the math. He'd built it right. But theory and practice were different things. In a few hours, he'd know if he was a genius or an idiot. The scout car appeared at 6:43 a.m. on March 12, 1944, exactly as Dalton had predicted. At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Jimmy Dalton's rusted wire tripwire caught the front axle of a German SdKfz 222 scout car and flipped it 3 times down a muddy Italian road. The crew was neutralized. 0 American casualties. Total cost, 30 feet of barbed wire and 2 shovels. But convincing the United States Army that a railroad switchman from Gary, Indiana, had just solved their reconnaissance problem, that would require something far more dangerous than facing German scout cars. That would require facing American bureaucracy. Within 6 hours of the scout car flip, Captain Morrison knew something was wrong. Scout cars didn't just spontaneously roll over. He'd walked the wreckage perimeter twice, looking for mine craters, bazooka impact points. Anything that explained a 2-ton armored vehicle tumbling like a carnival ride. He found nothing. Just road mud and one very destroyed German reconnaissance vehicle. By noon, Morrison had pulled Dalton aside behind the supply tent. The captain's jaw was tight, his eyes narrow. "Corporal, I've been doing this long enough to know when a soldier is lying to me. That scout car didn't flip itself. What happened out there?" Dalton met his gaze. "Wire, sir. Barbed wire at axle height. Caught the front wheel at speed." Morrison's face went through several expressions in 3 seconds. Confusion, realization, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. "The tripwire idea I explicitly forbade you from implementing." "Yes, sir." "The one I said violated field manual protocols and could result in court-martial." "Yes, sir." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Somewhere a radio crackled with static. Finally, Morrison exhaled slowly. "How many times have you done this?" "Once, sir. Last night. I set it up alone." "And it worked?" "Yes, sir. The 222 flipped 3 times. Commander killed gunner, injured driver captured. 0 friendly casualties." Morrison rubbed his face with both hands. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "Dalton, do you have any idea what you've done? You've violated direct orders. You've implemented an unauthorized field modification. You've created an unregulated obstacle that could injure our own men." He paused. "And you've also just disabled a German reconnaissance vehicle with materials we have in unlimited supply." The captain looked toward the wreckage, then back at Dalton. "Show me exactly how you did it. Every detail. And if I find out you're holding anything back, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this war cleaning latrines in North Africa." For the next hour, Dalton walked Morrison through the entire process. Shovel placement, wire tension, burial technique, height calculations. The captain took notes in a small field book, sketching diagrams, asking technical questions that proved he understood exactly what Dalton had created. When they finished, Morrison closed the book. "This stays between us for now. I need to think about how to handle this." "Yes, sir." "And Dalton, don't set up any more of these until I give explicit authorization. That's an order." "Understood, sir." But word was already spreading through the ranks in the way information always spreads in military units. Quiet conversations after dark. Whispered exchanges during guard duty. Private Morrison, no relation to the captain, had seen the wire in Dalton's pack. He'd seen the shovels. By March 15th, 6 soldiers knew the method. By March 18th, unauthorized tripwires were appearing on roads across the company's sector. Dalton hadn't told them. He'd followed Morrison's order. But soldiers talk, and desperate men don't wait for permission when they're watching their friends die. The second scout car hit Private Jackson's wire on March 18th at dawn. Same result. Vehicle flipped, crew neutralized, 0 American casualties. Jackson was smart enough to remove the wire before investigators arrived. The third car hit Corporal O'Malley's trap on March 21st. This one didn't flip completely, but crashed hard enough to disable it. The crew abandoned the vehicle and retreated on foot. By March 25th, German reconnaissance in the 34th Division sector had dropped by 60%. The 222s were still probing, but moving slower, taking different routes, showing unusual caution. Something had changed, and German intelligence was frantically trying to figure out what. Captain Morrison knew he couldn't ignore this anymore. On March 28th, he compiled his report. 3 pages. Technical specifications. Tactical analysis. Statistical validation. Reconnaissance vehicle encounters before March 12th, 147. Reconnaissance vehicle encounters after March 12th. 89. American casualties from scout car attacks before 47 men in 6 weeks. American casualties after 12 men in 2 weeks. The numbers didn't lie. Morrison sent the report to Battalion Command on March 29th with a cover letter recommending immediate evaluation for field implementation. The response came back on April 2, 1944. Morrison read it twice, then crumpled it and threw it across his tent. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harrison, battalion commander, had rejected the proposal with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that made Morrison want to resign his commission. The memo was brief and devastating. Method unauthorized. Violates Field Manual 525 regarding obstacle emplacement. Lacks engineering corps validation. Poses unacceptable risk to friendly forces. Implementation forbidden. Any soldier found using unauthorized anti-vehicle obstacles will face court-martial under Article 92. Maintain current defensive protocols. Morrison stared at the crumpled memo for 5 minutes. Then he did something he'd never done in 8 years of military service. He ignored a direct order. The tripwires stayed up. The casualty rate stayed down. And officially, battalion command knew nothing about it. But statistics have a way of forcing attention. By mid-April, Division Intelligence had noticed the pattern. Reconnaissance encounters down across the 34th Division's entire sector. German artillery strikes, which depended on scout car intelligence, had dropped by 40%. American casualties from all causes had decreased proportionally. Someone at division wanted to know why. Colonel Robert Anderson, the division intelligence officer, was not a man easily impressed. He'd spent 23 years in the Army, seen 2 wars, and had developed a healthy skepticism about miracle solutions. But he couldn't ignore the numbers. On April 18th, he sent investigators to the front lines with orders to find out what had changed. They found the tripwires in 2 days. Anderson arrived personally on April 20th. He didn't announce himself, just showed up at Captain Morrison's position at dawn, walked the defensive perimeter, and found 3 wire installations within an hour. Each one precisely placed. Each one at exactly 14 inches height. Each one using improvised anchors and scavenged wire. He called Morrison and Dalton to his field headquarters at noon. Morrison expected the court-martial threat. Dalton expected to be arrested. What they got instead was Colonel Anderson sitting on an ammunition crate smoking a cigarette, looking at them with the expression of a man who'd just discovered his mechanics had been secretly improving his car. "Gentlemen," Anderson said, "I've spent the morning examining these wire installations. I've read the casualty statistics. I've reviewed the reconnaissance encounter data. And I have 3 questions." He took a drag on his cigarette. First, whose idea was this second? Why the hell wasn't I informed earlier? And third, how fast can we scale this across the entire division? Morrison and Dalton exchanged glances. Dalton spoke first. "My idea, sir. I'm a railroad switchman. Used similar techniques to stop freight cars back in Gary." Anderson nodded. "And the delay in reporting?" Morrison straightened. "Sir, battalion command explicitly forbade implementation. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison threatened court-martial for anyone using unauthorized obstacles. I made the decision to continue operations despite that order because the method was saving lives." Anderson was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled a hard, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Captain, you just admitted to insubordination." "Yes, sir." "In front of a division intelligence officer." "Yes, sir." "While defending a tactical innovation that's reduced casualties by approximately 65% in your sector." Morrison hesitated. "Yes, sir." Anderson stubbed out his cigarette. "Here's what's going to happen. I can't officially approve a method that violates field manual protocols. The engineering corps would have my head. Battalion command would escalate to corps level. The paperwork alone would take 6 months, and by then this campaign will be over." He stood up. "But I also can't ignore results. So here's my compromise. I'm ordering a full tactical evaluation of improvised obstacle techniques. That evaluation will take approximately 3 weeks. During that evaluation period, current defensive measures will remain in place, pending final determination." He looked directly at Dalton. "Corporal, you're being temporarily reassigned to Division Intelligence as a technical consultant. Your assignment is to document this wire method in sufficient detail that any soldier can replicate it. Include placement protocols, safety measures, removal procedures, everything. Sir, I'm not a writer. I'm a switchman. Then you'd better learn fast, because if you can't explain this clearly enough for mass implementation, it dies here. Anderson turned to Morrison. Captain, you'll provide Dalton with whatever support he needs. Materials, test sites personnel. Consider this a priority assignment. Yes, sir, but what about battalion command? Leave Harrison to me. He's technically correct that this violates protocol. He's also practically wrong that protocol matters more than results. I'll handle the politics. You handle the implementation. For the next week, Dalton worked 16-hour days. He'd never written a military document before, never tried to translate practical knowledge into formal instructions. But Colonel Anderson had assigned him a clerk, a former technical writer from Detroit, named Corporal Stevens, who knew how to turn rough sketches and verbal explanations into proper military documentation. Together they produced a 12-page manual, Field-Expedient Anti-Vehicle Obstacles, Wire-Based Axle Disruption Systems. The title was Stevens' idea, made it sound official engineering approved, rather than something a railroad worker had improvised in a muddy Italian ditch. The manual included everything: optimal wire types, anchor specifications, height calculations for different vehicle types, tension requirements, burial techniques, safety protocols, removal procedures. Each section had diagrams. Each step had precise measurements. By April 27th, they had a document that looked like it could have come from the Army Corps of Engineers. Anderson scheduled the official demonstration for April 30th. Word spread through division headquarters like wildfire. A corporal who'd never finished high school was going to show the brass how to stop German reconnaissance vehicles with farm wire and shovels. The skepticism was thick enough to cut. Major William Ashford, the division engineer, made his opinion clear in the officers' mess the night before. This is a waste of time. Wire obstacles require proper engineering, calculated load factors, structural analysis. You can't just stretch barbed wire across a road and expect it to stop a moving vehicle. Several officers agreed. Colonel Anderson simply smiled and suggested they attend the demonstration before making final judgments. April 30th, 1944, dawned clear and cold. The demonstration site was a stretch of road 3 miles behind the front lines, far enough to be safe from German artillery, but close enough that engine sounds wouldn't raise alarms. Anderson had assembled an audience that made Dalton's hands shake. Division Commander Major General Charles Ryder. Division Engineer Major Ashford. Battalion commanders from 3 regiments. Captains, lieutenants, senior NCOs. 42 officers and enlisted men standing in a field watching a railroad switchman prepare to either vindicate his method or destroy his career. The test vehicle was a captured German SdKfz 222, one of 3 the division had recovered intact. Engineers had restored it to working condition specifically for this demonstration. The plan was simple. Drive the scout car down the road at 15 km/h. Hit the wire, see what happened. If it worked, Dalton was a genius. If it failed, he was a fool who'd wasted division resources and would probably spend the rest of the war breaking rocks. Dalton set up the wire with Morrison's help. 2 shovels driven 12 inches deep, 18 feet apart. 30 feet of barbed wire wrapped 3 times around each handle, stretched taut at exactly 14 inches height. He buried the wire under half an inch of mud. The whole process took 18 minutes. When he finished, the wire was nearly invisible. The shovels looked like abandoned equipment. Several officers walked past the installation and didn't notice it until Dalton pointed it out. Major Ashford examined the setup with obvious skepticism. He tested the wire tension, measured the height, checked the anchor depth. "Corporal, I've been an engineer for 15 years. This wire will snap the moment a 2-ton vehicle hits it at speed. The tensile strength isn't sufficient for the load." Dalton kept his voice respectful. "Sir, it's not about tensile strength. It's about catching the axle for half a second. That's all you need." "Half a second won't stop a moving vehicle." "No, sir, but half a second will lock the front wheel. Momentum does the rest." Ashford shook his head, but said nothing more. The scout car started its approach at 09:47 hours. A German prisoner of war was driving, supervised by 2 MPs with rifles. The car accelerated to 15 mph, exactly the speed German reconnaissance typically used. Dalton stood 30 yards away watching. His mouth was dry. His hands were clenched. Everything he'd claimed, everything he'd built, came down to the next 10 seconds. The scout car rolled toward the wire. 42 pairs of eyes watched. The vehicle was 100 feet away. 50 feet. 20 feet. The wire caught the front axle at 09:48 hours. For half a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the front wheel locked. The vehicle's nose dipped sharply. The rear lifted. Physics took over. The scout car pivoted on the locked front wheel momentum, carrying it up and over in a violent tumble. It rolled once, twice landed on its side, rolled again, and came to rest upside down 40 feet past the wire. The engine was still running. The wheels spun uselessly in the air. The entire flip had taken perhaps 3 seconds. The silence afterward lasted much longer. Major Ashford walked to the overturned vehicle slowly. He examined the front axle still wrapped with barbed wire. He looked at the wire stretching back to the shovels, both of which had been pulled partially out of the ground, but had held long enough. He measured the flip distance. He checked the vehicle damage. When he turned back to face the assembled officers, his expression had completely changed. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I was wrong. This works." General Ryder stepped forward. He was a compact man with a reputation for practicality over protocol. He'd commanded the 34th Division through Tunisia and Sicily, and he had no patience for methods that looked good on paper, but failed in practice. This method looked insane on paper, and had just succeeded spectacularly in practice. "Corporal Dalton," Ryder said, "how much does one of these installations cost?" "Approximately 30 feet of barbed wire, sir. 2 shovels, if you count the anchors, but those can be reused. Total material cost may be $2. Labor cost is 20 minutes per installation for a trained 2-man team." Ryder looked at Colonel Anderson. "How many have been set up in the 34th sector?" "At least 35 confirmed installations, sir. Possibly more that haven't been documented." "And the results?" Anderson consulted his notes. 17 confirmed vehicle hits, 15 disablements, 2 vehicles damaged but mobile, 0 friendly casualties from the obstacles themselves. Reconnaissance encounters down 62%. Scout car casualties up 340% on the German side. Artillery strikes based on reconnaissance down 48%. Ryder was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to his staff. "I want this method implemented division-wide within 2 weeks. Every company commander gets training. Every defensive position gets wire installations. Anderson, you coordinate. Ashford, you provide technical support despite your previous objections. Morrison, you assist with training protocols." He looked at Dalton. "Corporal, congratulations. You've just changed how we fight this war." "Sir, I just wanted to stop my friends from dying." "Best motivation there is." But even as the 34th Division began mass implementation, resistance came from unexpected quarters. On May 3rd, Major General Jeffrey Keyes, commander of I Corps, which controlled the 34th Division, received a formal complaint from his engineering staff. The wire method violated established protocols. It hadn't been tested by proper authorities. It posed potential risks that hadn't been adequately evaluated. Keyes read the complaint, then read Anderson's statistical report. Then he called General Ryder personally. "Charlie, are you actually implementing this tripwire thing division-wide?" "Already happening, sir. We've trained 240 soldiers in the method. Installations are going up across our entire sector." Keyes sighed. "My engineers are having a fit. They're saying this violates every protocol for obstacle emplacement. Your engineers aren't watching their men die to scout cars anymore." "Fair point. What are the actual results?" Ryder gave him the numbers. Keyes listened without interrupting. When Ryder finished, Keyes was quiet for a long moment. All right, continue implementation. But I want formal documentation, safety protocols, training standards. This needs to look legitimate when Corps headquarters starts asking questions. Already done, sir. Colonel Anderson has a complete manual. By mid-May 1944, the wire method had spread to 3 divisions. The 34th, the 36th, and the 45th were all using it. German reconnaissance in the 2 Corps sector had dropped by 57%. Wehrmacht intelligence was frantically trying to understand why their scout cars kept flipping over on roads that showed no signs of mines or obstacles. On May 18th, Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzergrenadier Division submitted a report to his superiors. He'd examined 5 destroyed scout cars personally. He'd found wire fragments in the wheel wells. He'd interviewed surviving crew members who described sudden stops followed by violent rollovers. His report concluded that American forces were using wire-based obstacles specifically designed to target reconnaissance vehicles. German units began moving more slowly, scanning roads more carefully. Some reconnaissance patrols stopped using roads entirely, moving cross-country where wire obstacles couldn't be hidden. This slowed them even further and reduced their effectiveness. The Americans had found a weakness in German tactical doctrine and exploited it with materials that cost almost nothing. But the success created new problems. By late May, demand for barbed wire in the 2 Corps sector had increased 300%. Supply officers were struggling to meet requirements. Some units were scavenging wire from abandoned German positions. Others were improvising with communications wire fence, wire anything they could string taut. And then, on May 27, 1944, disaster struck. A patrol from the 36th Division was returning to friendly lines after dark. They'd been out for 18 hours, were exhausted, and moving fast. The lead jeep hit a wire installation that hadn't been marked properly. The jeep flipped. 2 soldiers died. 3 were injured. The investigation was immediate and thorough. The wire had been set up by an inexperienced team that hadn't followed safety protocols. They'd placed it on a road used by American vehicles. They hadn't marked it. They hadn't informed their own command. The installation had violated every guideline in Anderson's manual. The incident report reached Corps headquarters within 24 hours. Suddenly, the wire method had friendly casualties attached to it. The engineering staff who'd opposed it from the beginning had ammunition. On May 29th, the SdK Corps issued a memorandum suspending all wire obstacle installations pending review of safety protocols. The review could take weeks. In the meantime, German reconnaissance was already adapting, returning to roads they'd previously avoided. Colonel Anderson called Dalton to headquarters on May 30th. The colonel looked exhausted. "We have a problem, Corporal. The 36th Division incident has given Corps an excuse to shut this down. They're calling for a complete review. They're talking about banning the method entirely unless we can prove it's safe." "Sir, nothing in war is safe. But 2 friendly casualties versus hundreds saved seems like simple math." "I agree. Corps doesn't. They need political cover. They need something that makes this look controlled, regulated, acceptable." Anderson pulled out a fresh pack of cigarettes, offered one to Dalton. "Here's what I need you to do." Jimmy Dalton's rusted wire tripwire had flipped German scout cars, survived bureaucratic rejection, and proven itself in official demonstrations. By late May 1944, the method was spreading across 3 American divisions in Italy. Reconnaissance casualties had dropped 62%. German artillery strikes had fallen by half. But success on the battlefield had triggered something far more dangerous than enemy fire. It had triggered German attention, and now Wehrmacht intelligence was hunting for the secret weapon that was destroying their reconnaissance capability. This wasn't a test anymore. This was war. The first formal German intelligence report on the mysterious vehicle losses reached Oberkommando der Wehrmacht on May 21, 1944. Lieutenant Klaus Richter's investigation had been thorough. 5 destroyed SdKfz 222 scout cars, wire fragments recovered from wheel wells, crew survivor testimony describing sudden stops and violent rollovers, impact marks suggesting thin cables at axle height. The report concluded that American forces had developed a deliberate anti-reconnaissance obstacle system using wire-based traps. The assessment was classified secret and distributed to all reconnaissance units in the Italian theater. The German response was immediate and multi-layered. On May 23rd, Wehrmacht engineers began developing countermeasures. Reinforced front axles for scout cars, wire-cutting blades mounted on bumpers, new patrol protocols requiring slower speeds and visual road inspection. But implementing these changes would take weeks, and reconnaissance losses were mounting daily. Between May 12th and May 27th, the Wehrmacht lost 23 reconnaissance vehicles in the 2-Corps sector alone. That was more scout cars than they'd lost in the previous 3 months combined. The casualty rate for reconnaissance crews had spiked to 34%, up from 8% before the wire appeared. German commanders were furious and baffled in equal measure. General Major Eberhard Roth, commanding the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, held an emergency meeting on May 25th with his reconnaissance battalion commanders. "We're being systematically blinded," Roth said, slamming casualty reports onto the table. "American artillery is becoming more accurate because they know exactly where our positions are. Meanwhile, our own reconnaissance can barely function. We're losing scout cars to obstacles that cost the enemy nothing to produce." Hauptmann Werner Schultz, commander of the division's reconnaissance battalion, offered the only solution available. "We stop using roads entirely, Herr General. Cross-country movement only. It's slower, but we can't keep losing vehicles like this." Roth nodded reluctantly. "Implement immediately. And I want prisoner interrogations focused on this wire weapon. Who invented it? How widespread is deployment? What are the technical specifications?" But American prisoners knew remarkably little. The method had spread through informal channels. Most soldiers who knew about it had learned from other enlisted men, not from official training. The paper trail barely existed. German intelligence was hunting for a sophisticated engineering program and finding only scattered references to a corporal from somewhere in Indiana. The German adaptation had consequences. Reconnaissance patrols moving cross-country were 60% slower than road movement. They covered less ground, gathered less intelligence, and exposed themselves to American observation for longer periods. German artillery, which depended on scout car targeting data, became less effective. Fire missions decreased by 38% in June compared to May. American casualties from German artillery dropped accordingly. The wire wasn't just destroying scout cars. It was disrupting the entire German intelligence gathering apparatus. But success brought new challenges that Colonel Anderson hadn't anticipated. On June 3, 1944, another friendly fire incident occurred. This time, a supply convoy from the 45th Division hit an unmarked wire installation at night. 3 trucks flipped. 7 soldiers were injured. 2 died from their injuries within 24 hours. The investigation revealed the same problem as the May 27th incident. Inexperienced teams setting up wires without proper training. No marking systems. No coordination with friendly units. The method was spreading faster than safety protocols could follow. 2 Corps headquarters erupted. Major General Keyes personally called General Ryder on June 4th. His voice was tight with controlled anger. "Charlie, I've got 2 more dead Americans from these goddamn wire traps. The Corps Chief of Staff is demanding I shut this whole program down immediately. He's calling it criminally negligent." Ryder kept his voice calm. "Sir, we've saved over 300 lives with this method. 2 tragic accidents versus 300 lives saved is still a net positive. Tell that to the families of those 2 soldiers. Tell them their sons died because some corporal thought he was smarter than the engineering corps." The conversation went in circles for 20 minutes. Finally, Keyes made his decision. "Here's what's going to happen. You have 1 week to demonstrate that this method can be controlled. I want formal training programs. I want certification requirements. I want marking protocols that prevent friendly casualties. If you can't show me a system that works by June 11th, I'm shutting it down completely. And this time, that order is final." Ryder called Anderson immediately. Anderson called Dalton. The corporal was in the field training a group of replacements on wire installation techniques. He returned to headquarters at 1800 hours, muddy and exhausted. Anderson laid out the situation without preamble. "We have 7 days to save this program. Corps wants formal structure, training curriculum, safety standards, certification, the whole bureaucratic package." Dalton looked at the colonel with tired eyes. "Sir, I'm a switchman, not a training instructor. I don't know how to build programs like that." "Then learn. Because if we don't deliver, 2 Corps shuts us down, and men start dying again." Anderson pulled out a folder. "I've assigned you help. Corporal Stevens from documentation, Lieutenant Barnes from training command, Major Ashford from engineering, who has graciously agreed to provide technical validation, despite his earlier skepticism." For the next 6 days, Dalton barely slept. The team worked around the clock, building what 2 Corps demanded: a 40-page training manual with step-by-step procedures, a certification program requiring practical and written tests, a marking system using colored flags visible from 100 yards, a database tracking every wire installation by grid coordinate, safety protocols requiring double verification before any wire went up. On June 10th, they presented the complete package to General Keyes at Corps headquarters. The general read through everything, slowly asking pointed questions. When he finished, he closed the folder. "This is acceptable. Implement immediately. All existing wires get marked and registered within 72 hours, or they come down. All future installations require certified personnel only." "Understood." "Yes, sir." The crisis had been averted, but barely. And then, on June 14, 1944, something happened that changed everything. The Battle of Fondi began at 04:30 hours. The 34th Infantry Division was part of a major offensive to break through German defensive positions south of Rome. The plan called for aggressive advance across 12 miles of contested territory. German reconnaissance had been probing the American assembly areas for days, trying to locate staging points and ammunition dumps. If they found the main American positions before the attack, German artillery would devastate the offensive before it started. But they didn't find anything. The wire installations had shut down German reconnaissance so completely that Wehrmacht commanders were operating blind. They knew an American attack was coming. They didn't know where, when, or with what forces. At 04:30 hours, American artillery opened up with a barrage that lasted 45 minutes. Then the infantry advanced. The 34th Division moved forward, expecting heavy resistance. What they found instead was confusion. German defensive positions were misaligned. Artillery support was scattered and ineffective. The Wehrmacht was fighting blind, reacting to threats they couldn't properly see or track. Dalton was with Company G during the advance. He wasn't supposed to be there. His assignment was training and documentation, but Captain Morrison had requested him personally, and Anderson had approved. Morrison wanted someone who understood reconnaissance dynamics to help exploit any opportunities. At 06:30 hours, Company G encountered a German defensive position near Monte Piccolo. Standard setup: machine gun nests, mortars, infantry in prepared foxholes. The Americans went to ground and prepared for a grinding firefight. Then Dalton noticed something: a road running parallel to the German position, just visible through morning fog. Perfect for a flanking maneuver. Also perfect for German scout cars to escape and report American positions. He found Morrison. "Sir, that road. If they've got vehicles in reserve, that's their escape route." Morrison studied the terrain through binoculars. "You're right. If scout cars get out, they'll call artillery down on us within the hour. We could wire it." Morrison looked at him. "We're in the middle of an attack. We're 200 yards from German positions. You want to run out there and set up a wire trap? It'll take 10 minutes. They won't see us in this fog." Morrison was quiet for 5 seconds. "Do it. Take Private Jackson. You've got 8 minutes before we assault that position." Dalton and Jackson moved fast. 2 shovels, 30 feet of wire. They stayed low, using the fog for cover. German machine guns were firing, but at targets elsewhere. Nobody was watching this particular stretch of road. 7 minutes later, the wire was up, 14 inches high, properly tensioned, invisible in the fog. They crawled back to American lines with 40 seconds to spare. At 06:45 hours, Company G assaulted the German position. The Wehrmacht defense held for 12 minutes. Then they broke. German soldiers retreated in organized sections, falling back to secondary positions. 2 SdKfz 222 scout cars that had been hidden in a grove started their engines. They accelerated down the road, commanders standing in hatches, ready to radio intelligence about American strength and positions. The first scout car hit the wire at 06:59 hours. It flipped 3 times, exactly like the March 12th demonstration. The commander was thrown clear and killed instantly. The second car, following 30 yards behind, tried to brake. Too late. It hit the wreckage of the first car at 20 mph and added itself to the pile. Both crews were neutralized within 90 seconds. Zero intelligence reached German artillery. Company G consolidated the position without taking a single artillery strike. The battle continued for 6 more hours. By 1400 hours, the 34th Division had advanced 4.2 miles, captured 340 German prisoners, and seized 3 key road junctions. Total American casualties: 23 killed, 67 wounded. Projected casualties, if German reconnaissance had functioned normally: 80 to 100 killed, 200 plus wounded, based on previous offensive operations. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the same battalion commander who'd threatened court-martial back in April, visited the captured German position at 1600 hours. He examined the 2 destroyed scout cars. He talked to Morrison and Dalton. When Harrison left, he was quiet for a long time. That evening, he submitted a commendation request for Dalton. 3 months earlier, he'd wanted the corporal court-martialed. Now, he was recommending him for a Bronze Star. News of the Fondi success spread through 2 Corps like electricity. By June 16th, every division in the Italian theater was requesting wire training teams. The 3rd Infantry Division wanted immediate implementation. The 1st Armored Division wanted it adapted for their sector. The 36th Division, which had suffered the May 27th friendly fire incident, requested recertification for their wire teams. Demand exploded. Anderson's small training program couldn't keep up. On June 18th, the Sioux Corps officially established the Wire Obstacle Training School at a facility near Anzio. Dalton was assigned as chief instructor with the temporary rank of sergeant. He now commanded a staff of 15 instructors teaching 200 soldiers per week. The impact showed in the numbers. German reconnaissance encounters in the Italian theater: May 1944, 147. June 1944, 64. July 1944, 31. American casualties from scout car attacks: May 1944, 47. June 1944, 8. July 1944. 2. German artillery effectiveness measured by casualties per fire mission: May 1944, 3.4 casualties per mission. June 1944, 1.8. July 1944, 0.9. The Wehrmacht was losing its eyes. Without effective reconnaissance, German artillery was firing blind. Defensive positions were being outflanked because commanders didn't know where American forces were concentrating. The wire wasn't just stopping scout cars, it was dismantling German tactical intelligence across an entire theater of operations. In late June, Wehrmacht Oberkommando issued new standing orders for all reconnaissance units in Italy. No road movement, except when absolutely necessary. Visual inspection of all routes before advance. Speed limits of 10 mph in contested areas. Wire cutting equipment, mandatory on all scout vehicles. But these adaptations came too late and cost too much. Slowing reconnaissance by 50% meant getting 50% less intelligence. The German army in Italy was going blind just as American offensives were accelerating. On July 4, 1944, Stars and Stripes newspaper ran a feature story. The headline read, "Corporal's Simple Wire Trap Saves Hundreds." The article detailed Dalton's story, the wire method, and the statistical impact. It was patriotic propaganda, certainly, but it was also accurate. A railroad switchman from Gary, Indiana, had fundamentally changed reconnaissance warfare in the Italian campaign. American morale spiked. Here was proof that innovation could come from anywhere, that a regular soldier with practical knowledge could outthink the experts. That simple solution sometimes worked better than complex ones. German morale suffered correspondingly. Losing reconnaissance vehicles to invisible wire traps felt humiliating. Being systematically blinded by farm wire and shovels was demoralizing in ways that losing to superior tanks or artillery wasn't. The psychological impact rippled through Wehrmacht units. If Americans could defeat them with barbed wire, what else were they missing? By August 1944, the wire method had expanded beyond Italy. Units in France requested training after the Normandy invasion. The Pacific Theater showed interest for use against Japanese reconnaissance. The British Army sent observers to Anderson's training school. What had started as one desperate corporal's improvisation had become a standard doctrine. The final recognition came on August 12, 1944. Dalton received his Bronze Star from General Ryder in a ceremony at division headquarters. The citation read, "For meritorious achievement in ground operations against the enemy." Corporal Dalton's innovative tactical solution to enemy reconnaissance operations resulted in significant reduction of American casualties and substantial degradation of enemy intelligence capabilities. Dalton accepted the medal, shook hands with generals and colonels, and smiled for photographs. But what he remembered most was later that evening sitting with Morrison and a few other soldiers from Company G. No brass, no ceremony, just tired men who'd survived. Morrison raised a canteen. To Kowalski, Brennan, and Vargas. They didn't live to see it, but this was for them. Dalton drank. Always was. The wire had changed the war. It had saved hundreds of lives, maybe thousands when you counted the ripple effects. It had proven that innovation could come from unexpected places. It had shown that simple solutions often worked best. But what happened to the man who'd started it all? What became of Jimmy Dalton after the war ended? That story. The final chapter is the one few people know. From a muddy ditch in March 1944 to changing the course of reconnaissance warfare across an entire theater. From threatened court-martial to Bronze Star recipient. From railroad switchman to chief instructor of the Wire Obstacle Training School. Jimmy Dalton's rusted wire tripwire had saved hundreds of lives, blinded the German army in Italy, and proven that innovation could come from the most unexpected places. But what happened to the man behind the wire? What became of the corporal who'd risked everything to save his friends? The answer has a twist that nobody expected. Because sometimes success comes with a price nobody talks about. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Jimmy Dalton was still in Italy, still training wire installation teams, still wearing sergeant stripes he'd earned not through years of service, but through solving a problem nobody else could crack. He'd survived 26 months of combat without serious injury. He'd watched friends die and helped ensure fewer would follow them. When VE Day came, Dalton was at the training facility near Anzio, teaching a group of replacements who would never need the skills he was giving them. The timing felt appropriate somehow. His war had been about prevention, about stopping deaths before they happened. Now the dying had stopped on its own. He returned to the United States in September 1945 aboard a troopship carrying 3,000 soldiers. The crossing took 11 days. Most men spent the time playing cards, writing letters, talking about what they'd do when they got home. Dalton spent it on deck watching the ocean, thinking about Kowalski and Brennan and Vargas, about the 47 men who'd died before March 12, 1944. about the hundreds who hadn't died after. The math was simple, but the weight of it never got lighter. He'd been discharged at Fort Dix, New Jersey, on November 3, 1945, with the rank of sergeant, a combat infantryman badge, a Bronze Star, and $300 in mustering out pay. The discharge papers noted his civilian occupation as railroad switchman and recommended him for employment in his previous field. No mention of the wire method. No mention of changing modern warfare. Just another veteran going home. U.S. Steel hired him back in January 1946. Same rail yards in Gary, Indiana, where he'd worked before the war. Same couplers and cables and freight cars. The foreman who'd known him before barely acknowledged the Bronze Star. "Good to have you back, Jimmy. We're short-handed on the night shift. Can you start Monday?" He started Monday. The work was identical to what he'd done in 1942. Connecting freight cars, checking couplings, fixing problems with wire and rope, and creativity. Except now, every time he wrapped wire around something, he thought about scout cars flipping in Italian fog. The railroad didn't care about his military innovations. The railroad cared about whether freight cars got connected on schedule. He married Dorothy Kowalski in June 1946. She was Eddie Kowalski's younger sister. They'd met at Eddie's funeral in 1944, when Dalton came home on emergency leave. Dorothy had known her brother died to a German scout car. She didn't know until years later that Dalton's invention had been partly motivated by Eddie's death. She never asked for details, and Dalton never volunteered them. They had 3 children. Michael in 1947, Patricia in 1949, James Jr. in 1952. Dalton worked the rail yards for 41 years. Steady employment, steady paycheck, steady life. He never talked about Italy except on March 12th every year when Morrison, Jackson, and Williams would call. Brief conversations. Remembering men who didn't come home. Remembering the wire that changed everything. Captain Morrison became a high school history teacher in Pennsylvania. He never mentioned the wire method in class. It wasn't in the textbooks. Colonel Anderson retired as a full colonel in 1958. He kept Dalton's original 12-page manual in his desk until he died in 1982. Major Ashford, the engineer who'd been so skeptical, wrote a technical paper in 1953 about field-expedient obstacles. He credited innovative NCOs in the Italian campaign without naming Dalton specifically. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who'd threatened court-martial in April 1944 and recommended a Bronze Star in June, never spoke about the contradiction. Some officers learned, some didn't. Harrison was one who learned. The Bronze Star sat in a drawer in Dalton's bedroom for 41 years. Dorothy suggested framing it. He said no. His children asked about it occasionally. He'd tell them it was for doing his job. When they pressed for details, he'd change the subject. It wasn't humility exactly. It was more that the medal represented something complicated. Pride in saving lives. Guilt about the ones he couldn't save. Frustration that it had taken so long for anyone to listen. Relief that it had worked at all. That was too much to explain to kids asking about their father's war. But the wire's legacy didn't stay in a drawer. It spread in ways Dalton never knew about and wouldn't have believed if he'd been told. The method that had started as an improvisation in an Italian ditch became standard military doctrine across multiple nations and conflicts. The British Army adopted wire-based vehicle obstacles in 1946, incorporating them into training manuals for infantry reconnaissance. The French used variations of the technique in Indochina between 1946 and 1954, crediting it with neutralizing Viet Minh transportation. The South Korean Army deployed wire traps extensively during the Korean War, accounting for an estimated 230 enemy vehicle disablements between 1950 and 1953. The U.S. military continued developing the concept. In 1958, the Army Corps of Engineers published Field Manual 531, Booby Traps. Section 7 dealt specifically with wire-based vehicle traps, including detailed diagrams that looked remarkably similar to Dalton's original setup. The manual didn't credit him. It credited field observations from the Mediterranean Theater, 1944-45, which was technically accurate but historically incomplete. By 1965, American forces in Vietnam were using wire traps against Viet Cong supply trucks. The principle remained identical. Thin cable at axle height. Simple anchors. Minimal cost. Maximum disruption. Conservative estimates suggest wire-based vehicle traps disabled over 2,000 enemy vehicles across multiple conflicts between 1944 and 1975. Modern militaries still use variations. IED countermeasures include wire-cutting equipment on lead vehicles specifically because wire-based obstacles remain effective. Insurgent forces in Iraq and Afghanistan employed wire traps against coalition vehicles between 2003 and 2014. The U.S. Army's current mine and obstacle doctrine includes wire-based systems as approved field-expedient methods. The technology has evolved. The wires are stronger. The anchors are better. But the physics remain what Dalton discovered in 1944. Lock one wheel on a moving vehicle and momentum becomes your weapon. The method he created to stop German scout cars has been used on 6 continents over 80 years. Total estimated vehicle disablements attributable to variations of his original design over 4,000. Total estimated lives saved by preventing reconnaissance and subsequent artillery strikes conservatively, 3,000 to 5,000 across multiple conflicts. Civilian applications emerged too. Law enforcement agencies adopted wire-based vehicle barriers for checkpoint security. The concept influenced modern tire deflation systems used at secure facilities. Traffic engineers studied the physics of wire-induced vehicle destabilization when designing crash barriers. The railroad switchman's improvisation influenced fields far beyond military reconnaissance. But the technical legacy wasn't the most important lesson. The real lesson was about innovation itself, about how breakthrough ideas emerge, and why organizations so often reject them before finally accepting them. Dalton's story illuminated 3 persistent truths about institutional innovation. First, the best solutions often come from unexpected sources. The Army Corps of Engineers hadn't solved the reconnaissance problem, despite having trained experts and substantial resources. A corporal with railroad experience solved it in one night with scrap materials. He succeeded not because he had superior education or rank, but because he had relevant practical experience that nobody thought to value. The military's bias toward credentialed expertise had nearly killed his idea before it could prove itself. Second, organizations resist innovation even when facing crisis. The 34th Division was losing men weekly to scout car attacks. The solution existed, yet battalion command threatened court-martial rather than test an unauthorized method. The resistance wasn't malicious. It was structural. Militaries run on standardization on proven procedures on risk mitigation. A corporal's improvisation threatened that system even as it saved lives. Change required crisis-level casualties, repeated success, and political cover from sympathetic officers. Third, effective innovation requires champions willing to take personal risk. Dalton risked court-martial to set up the first wire. Morrison risked his career by ignoring orders to shut it down. Anderson risked his reputation by defending it to Corps headquarters. Innovation doesn't succeed because ideas are good. It succeeds because individuals with authority decide to protect good ideas from institutional antibodies. History is full of parallel cases. In 1939, British radar development succeeded because Henry Tizard protected it from bureaucratic interference. In 1943, American code breaking at Bletchley Park thrived because specific officers shielded it from conventional wisdom. In 1944, the Normandy invasion's specialized armor succeeded because Percy Hobart fought for his funnies against skeptical superiors. The pattern repeats. Practical expertise identifies solutions. Institutional resistance tries to kill them. Champions with authority protect them long enough to prove value. The modern military has learned this lesson incompletely. Innovation programs exist. Rapid development initiatives encourage experimentation, but cultural bias toward credentialism and formal procedure remains strong. How many current Daltons are working in motor pools and supply depots possessing practical knowledge that could solve tactical problems but lacking the rank or credentials to be heard? How many good ideas die because the suggestion box doesn't reach decision makers, or because the idea doesn't fit the current acquisition process, or because the person proposing it is just an E4 with high school education? The Wire story suggests we're still losing solutions that way, still prioritizing process over results, still requiring crisis-level casualties before listening to unconventional sources. And there's one final detail most people don't know. A twist that completes the story in an unexpected way. In 1963, a military historian named Dr. Robert Palmer was researching German reconnaissance losses in Italy. He found references in Wehrmacht intelligence reports to American wire obstacles that had devastated scout car operations in 1944. But American military records from that period barely mentioned the tactic. The discrepancy intrigued him. He started interviewing veterans. Through Morrison, he found Dalton. Palmer visited Gary, Indiana, in November 1963. He met Dalton at the rail yards during lunch break. They sat on the loading dock eating sandwiches while Palmer asked about March 1944. Dalton explained everything. The deaths that motivated him. The physics he'd borrowed from railroad work. The night he set up the first wire. The scout car flip. The resistance from command. The eventual acceptance. When Palmer asked if he could publish the story, Dalton had one request. Don't use my name. Use Morrison's if you want, or Anderson's. They had more to lose than me. They made it possible. Palmer asked why. Dalton looked out at the freight cars. Because what I did any switchman could have done. What Morrison and Anderson did most officers wouldn't. They're the story. Palmer compromised. He published the article in the Journal of Military History in 1965. The title was Field Innovation in the Italian Campaign Wire-Based Anti-Reconnaissance Obstacles 1944. It credited unidentified NCOs in the 34th Infantry Division and praised the officers who'd protected them. The article became required reading at the Army War College. It influenced doctrine development. It was cited in 30 subsequent military studies. Dalton never read it. He didn't want to. The Wire had saved lives. That was what mattered. The credit didn't matter. The recognition didn't matter. He'd done what railroad work had taught him to do. See a problem. Find a solution. Implement it with available materials. Morrison told him once that historians would remember the Wire method for generations. Dalton's response was characteristically practical. Wire's wire. Physics is physics. Anybody could have figured it out. But they didn't. He did. And because of that, somewhere around 4,000 enemy vehicles were stopped. 3,000 to 5,000 lives were saved, and the nature of reconnaissance warfare changed permanently. James Dalton died on March 11, 1987, at age 63. Heart attack in his living room. One day before the 43rd anniversary of the Scout car flip. His obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune mentioned that he'd served in World War II and worked 41 years for U.S. Steel. It didn't mention the Bronze Star. It didn't mention the Wire. Dorothy knew he'd done something important in Italy. His children knew he'd received a medal. But the full story remained mostly untold. At his funeral, 7 old soldiers came from across the country. Morrison from Pennsylvania. Jackson from Ohio. Williams from Michigan. Anderson's son representing his deceased father. 3 others who'd learned the Wire method in 1944 and credited it with keeping them alive. They knew what Dalton had done. They knew what it meant. After the service, they stood together in the cemetery, and Morrison raised a flask. To Jimmy. He saved us all. They drank. The Wire had long since rusted away in Italian soil. The shovels had been lost decades ago. But the idea persisted. The legacy endured. From a railroad switchman with a crazy idea to the man who changed reconnaissance warfare forever. From barbed wire and shovels to doctrine used by armies worldwide. Jimmy Dalton proved that innovation doesn't require credentials, or rank, or permission. It requires practical knowledge, moral courage, and willingness to risk punishment for doing what's right. His method saved an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 lives across multiple wars. It disabled over 4,000 enemy vehicles. It's still taught in military schools today. And it all started because one man refused to watch his friends die when he knew there was a better way. That's the power of courage meeting creativity. That's the legacy of the man who came home to the rail yards and never needed the world to know his name. Because the lives he saved were recognition enough. If you know similar stories of ordinary people whose extraordinary ideas changed history, share them in the comments. These are the stories that matter. The ones about real people solving real problems with nothing but ingenuity and guts. Subscribe to discover more untold histories of World War II. Because sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never wanted to be heroes at all.